A good Tavach, and thank you for joining us in this shir in Project Likutei Sichos. Today's shir is in Chelek Tes Zayin, the first Sicha on Parshas Boy. Before we get to the Sicha inside, just a bit of background. The Sicha is from a Farbrengen of Achron Shal Pesach Toshin Yud Gimel, Achron Shal Pesach 1953. And during the course of the Farbrengen, the Rabbi gave a bit of an introduction explaining that this Sicha is about something which is technically, it's a Nigla topic. So the Sicha revolves around something that the Rambam describes, but nevertheless, the explanation, the beer for it, is only al pi Chassidus. It's one of those things that Nigla doesn't adequately cover. It's one of those things that only Chassidus explains. And the Rebbe goes on to explain in that Farbrengen, which didn't make it into the Mugadik Sicha, but the Rebbe explains that everything in this world, in order to show that you need something higher than it to really understand it better. So in Torah, we find certain things in Nigla that don't have an explanation according to Nigla. And we need Chassidus to come and explain them in order to show us the necessity of learning Nigla only with Chassidus. So this Sicha is one of those places where the Rebbe explains such a concept, something that according to Nigla has no answer, only according to Chassidus. The Sicha revolves around the halachos of Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh, which are from the more complicated halachos in the Rambam, the halachos of how we calculate the sun and the moon, the months, the years, etc., and the necessity and the needs for all those complicated calculations. Obviously, it belongs in Parshas Boy because Parshas Boy is the pasuk HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem, which teaches us the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh. The mitzvah for Beis Din to calculate these months and years according to halacha are in Parshas Boy. So, as I mentioned, the Sicha itself includes a lot of detail. I don't know if we'll be able to cover all the details, but we'll definitely cover the main points of the Sicha, the highlights of the Sicha, the high points, and try to give some necessary background as we go along, so we'll understand what the Rebbe is talking about over here. So the Rebbe begins by quoting the halacha in the beginning of the Rambam. The Rambam begins Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh by telling us that there are two distinct methods of calculation. There's the Chodashim, the months, and the months that we calculate always follow the cycle of the moon. The moon cycle is 29 and a half days, and the cycle of the moon from nothing to a full moon and then back to nothing, 29 and a half days, that constitutes a monthly cycle. The calculation of the years that we and the Rambam brings a pasuk for it, Chodesh Hazeh Lochem, a pasuk that we calculate according to the moon. And then we have the years. The years that we calculate always follow the cycle of the sun, the solar cycle. As the pasuk says, Shomer, as Chodesh Aviv, that we have to guard that the month of Pesach should always fall out during the Pesach, during Kufas Nissen, as we're going to explain in a moment. Briefly, what that means is this is the basis for why we have to have Shana Mu'uberes, why we have to have a leap year in Halacha, because the moon cycle, 29 and a half days times 12, is only 354 days. The sun's cycle is 365 plus days. And in order for these two cycles to even out, eventually we need to have a Shana Mu'uberes. We have to have a leap year every 2 or 3 years to have a leap year, in order to allow for the lunar cycle to catch up with the solar cycle, as we're going to see soon. Now, in essence, there are two distinct halachos over here that the Rambam is telling us in this first description. What is the Rambam telling us? The Rambam is telling us two things. That the months of the year are calculated according to the moon, which means that a month is not a 12th of a solar year. We don't take the solar year and divide it by 12, which is the way the secular calendar is designed. It takes 365 days and divide it by 12. Rather, the months, according to the Torah, follow a set cycle of the moon, the lunar cycle of 29 and a half days. Nevertheless, because we know that Pesach must always fall out during springtime, if we only follow the lunar cycle does not follow the seasons. The seasons follow the cycle of the sun, the solar cycle. And therefore, if we only followed the moon and every 12 months, every 12 lunar months, we'd have another year. What would end up happening is Pesach would fall behind 11 days every year, 11 days earlier, until Pesach would fall earlier than Kufas Nissen. Kufas Nissen means the springtime season. And therefore, it's important to have a leap year, to add an extra month, the Shana Mu'uberes, in order to account for this. That's the first thing. The Rambam continues later on that today we have a set calculation of how this works, and today we have this system of 19-year cycles, and every 19-year cycles we have the sun and the moon coming almost to the exact point. When the Rambam tells us this halacha, that the sun and the moon because of the Shana Muberes that we have in the system as we have it, that every 19 years there are 7 Shana Mubereses, there are 7 leap years. The Rambam tells us that according to our math, according to this calculation, what's the difference between the lunar cycle and the solar cycle? After 19 years, after the entire cycle, the difference is going to be 1 hour and Taf Pei Hey Chalakim, and 485 Chalakim. We know the Rambam tells us that when he calculates in the Chos Kedesh HaChodesh, he divides every hour into 1,080 Chalakim. So if there's 1,080 Chalakim in every hour, so the difference between the lunar cycle and the solar cycle after 19 years, when they almost equal up, the difference between them, the gap, is going to be the She'eris, as the Rambam calls it, is going to be 1 hour and 485 Chalakim. That's what the Rambam tells us in the context of calculating, when it comes to calculating the moon and the years and the months, in the context of explaining to us why we have to have a Shana Mu'beres and how the Shana Mu'beres is calculated. He tells us is going to be this excess of 1 hour and 485 Chalakim every 19 years. So one of the commentaries on the Mishnah, which is called on the Rambam, which is called the Pirush, asks a very simple question: if every single 19 years we have an extra hour and 485 Chalakim, so after 38 years, it's going to be doubled. And then after another 19 years after that, it's going to be triple and more. And what it's going to end up happening is that these hour and 485 Chalakim, after enough cycles, are going to catch up to the point that one day, he says like this, he says one day, what's going to happen is that the Kufa of Nisan, in other words, the season, according to the solar cycle, is not going to start during the month of Nisan. Rather, it's going to start during the month of Iyar. And the Rambam just told us that the month of Nisan always must fall out, Chodesh HaAviv, that the month of Nisan always must be during the spring season, which means that Kufas Nisan needs to begin during the month of Nisan. The question is, how does that work out? If you have an extra hour and 100 and 485 Chalakim every cycle, eventually it's going to add up and it's going to slowly push the Kufa further and further and further, until the Kufa is going to be fall out during Iyar. So this Pirush, this commentary called the Pirush, answers and he says, Yavai Moed Tzedek V'Yodienu, which means that Mashiach is going to come and he's going to tell us. Now the Mefarshim point out, and the Rabbi brings it in the Sicha, that all the way until the end of 6,000 years, it's never going to happen that the Kufa is actually going to be during the month of Iyar. It's always going to fall out during the month of Nisan. So when he says over Yavai Moed Tzedek, so one of the Mefarshim explain, the Yavai Moed Tzedek means that when Mashiach is going to come, by then we'll have it figured out. Or it means that by then already Mashiach will give us another cheshbon how to calculate. Whatever it means, the point is that the question is a hypothetical question, but it's not a realistic question, because we don't have this problem, at least for the first 6,000 years, the Hava Alma, the 6,000 years of the world, we're not going to have this problem. Okay, so that is a question and an answer. The Rabbi asks a question that this only accounts for one piece of the puzzle. The second piece of the puzzle that this does not account for. What's the second piece of the puzzle? The second piece of the puzzle is that really there's two distinct dinim. There's one din that says that the Kufa of Nisan must take place during the month of Nisan, which means that there's a din when you want to set up a year, that the year needs to be set up in such a way that the Kufa of Nisan has to begin during the month of Nisan. So that's one din. But the truth is that we have a second din. The second din that we have is that Pesach, which is only halfway during the month through Nisan, Pesach must always be after the Kufa of Nisan began, which means that Pesach, the Yontif of Pesach, needs to happen during springtime. And if the Kufa falls out on Tez Zayin Nisan, so the halach is that you have to have an Iber yard during that year in order to make sure that the Kufa of Nisan takes place before Pesach begins, in order for Pesach to be during the spring season. So the question is, if that's the case, so the answer that the 1 hour and 485 Chalakim are not going to add up to push the Kufa of Nisan all the way into the month of Iyar, that doesn't help us for Pesach. Pesach is still its own problem. Pesach still needs to be during the Kufa of Nisan. And therefore, when it comes to this cheshbon, when it comes to this math, it seems that this thing doesn't take into consideration the din of Pesach. And the problem is that this question is not a hypothetical question, this is a realistic question. The reason is because the Kufa already numerous times did fall out after Tezvav Nisan. And the din hypothetically is supposed to be that whenever you have the Kufa after Tesvav Nisan, then you're supposed to have an Iber, you're supposed to make a Shana Muberes, you're supposed to add an extra month in order for the Kufa to end up being not in the month of Nisan, it should be in the month of Adar, in order to allow for Pesach to be during Kufas Nisan, during the springtime. But La Halacha, we don't find that that's the case. La Halacha, there were times, and in the Haaretz, the Rebbe goes into different years of when this actually happened in history. Different years, usually it was during year 16 of the 19-year cycles, what it seems like, based on the math. So during year 16 of numerous cycles, it seems that there were years that the Kufa fell out either on the 17th of Nisan or later, the 16th of Nisan or later, and we don't find that it ended up being a Shana Muberes. It didn't add an extra Adar during those years. And the reason why the extra Adar wasn't added is very simple. It's because we already have the Cheshbon, we already have our calculator, our calendar set based on what Rabbi Hillel Anasi set up. So our calendar is already set. We're not adding months of Shana Muberes. But according to what the Rambam says, the calendar of Rabbi Hillel Anasi is set up in such a way that Nisan sometimes will fall out after the Tkufa. I'm sorry, that the Tkufa will fall out after the first day of Pesach. And the question is, how is that possible? The halach is that Pesach has to be, the beginning of Pesach needs to be after the Kufa of Nisan, after springtime begins. That's the question that the Rebbe asks here in Sif Aleph. The answer to this question, the Rebbe is not going to get to until we get all the way to the end of the Sicha. The Rebbe is going to address this question all the way at the end. Now, before we continue, it's important to remember, it's important to give an introduction here, that there are two ways to calculate the Tkufa. We speak over here about the Tkufa, and it's important to understand, first of all, what's the Tkufa and how the Tkufa gets calculated. So the Kufa in brief are the 4 seasons of the year as they are divided during the entire solar calendar. Now the Rambam tells us that there are 2 opinions how long the solar year, the solar cycle is supposed to be. One opinion says that it's 365 days and a quarter days, exactly to the point. Exactly 365 days and a quarter day, a quarter meaning 6 hours, so it's 365 plus 6 hours, exactly. That's one opinion of calculating it. That's the calculation of Tkufas Shmuel, as it's called. And then there's a second opinion, which is known as Tkufas Rav Ada. Tkufas Rav Ada is that 365 and a quarter days minus. In other words, it's a little bit shorter according to the Tkufa of Rav Ada. What's the advantage of Tkufas Rav Ada? So the Rambam tells us later on in Perek Tes and Perek Yud, the Rambam says later on that the Tkufa of Rav Ada has an advantage over Tkufas Shmuel. According to the calculation of Shmuel, that the lunar cycle is 365 days and a full 6 hours. So then, after 19 years, the difference between the lunar and the solar is going to be an hour and 485 parts, 485 chalakim. But according to Tkufas Rav Ada, that the solar year is a little tiny bit shorter. So according to Tkufas Rav Ada's calculation is more precise because after 19 years, the lunar and the solar, they meet up precisely at the same point. There's no difference. So the Rebbe says, the Rambam himself brings down both of these in halacha, and he tells us that the Tkufa of Rav Ada is more accurate. And because the Tkufa of Rav Ada is more accurate, after 19 years, there's no extras that the solar overruns the lunar cycle. In other words, there's no extra hour and tough pei 485 chalakim. So according to this, it seems like the simple answer would be that for this we follow the Kufa of Rav Ada. In other words, with regards to this, we accept that Rav Ada's Kufa, Rav Ada's calculation is more accurate, more precise. And with regards to this, and with regards to halacha, we follow the Kufa of Rav Ada. So that would be the easy answer. The problem is the wording of the Rambam doesn't say this. When the Rambam tells us why we follow Rav Ada, what does the Rambam say? The reason why we follow Rav Ada, he says the reason is because it's more accurate and there's no extras. According to the question that we just mentioned, the Rambam could have said a much simpler thing. The Rambam could have said, because according to the calculation of Rav Ada, there's no issue with Pesach. According to the calculation of Shmuel, we run into problems with Pesach, which we have no answer for, according to our calendar. But according to the Kufa of Rav Ada's Kufa is exact, and after every 19 years it's exact, and there's no extras, so the Kufa is not getting pushed off further and further. So when the Rambam describes why we follow Rav Ada, instead of mentioning that Rav Ada is more precise because there's no extras, you should have just said something more obvious, that Pesach doesn't fall out ever during the winter according to the Kufa of Rav Ada. That's the question that the Rebbe has over here. Now, the Rebbe's answer is going to explain to us that in essence, when we speak about the Kufa is more than just a physical thing in terms of calculating the actual physical calculation of the sun. In other words, that the sun and the moon are much more than just what we see when we look at the sky. There's something much more that's going on over here. And the answer, the nakuda, the point of the answer goes as follows: that when we speak about the idea of the Kufa, and the Rambam in Halacha mentions both opinions, both the Kufa of Shmuel and the Kufa of Rav Ada, even though mathematically Rav Ada's Kufa might be more accurate. Rav Ada's Kufa might help us avoid the question of what to do with Pesach during those years that the Kufa ends up being, according to Shmuel, ends up being on the 16th of Nisan, and it turns out that the 15th of Nisan still ends up being during the winter season. Nevertheless, in spite of all of that, there's something about the Kufa of Shmuel, which obviously the fact that the Rambam brings it in Halacha, it's not just mentioned in the Gemara, which tells us that's part of Torah, but it's mentioned in Halacha. It's mentioned in the Rambam. The Rambam brings the Kufa of Shmuel in a Sefer of Halachas. Obviously, what that tells us is that the Kufa of Shmuel also has something to it, which is real, and which Halacha takes into consideration, even though we don't understand how the math works out. And the fact that the math doesn't always work out, we're going to see in a moment, isn't going to be a question. How do we know that the cheshbon of Shmuel is also accepted in halacha? So the Rebbe says that there's certain things in halacha which we follow only the calculation of Shmuel, not the calculation of Rav Ada. And the Rebbe brings over 3 different examples over here for this halacha. One example is the halacha of saying Birkas Achama. We say the bracha over the sun. Every 28 years, the sun comes to the same place where it was at the time of creation, which is during the month of Nisan. So every 28 years, we say the bracha, and that math only works out according to the Kufa of Shmuel, not according to the Kufa of Rav Ada. According to the Kufa of Rav Ada, it would be different. The same thing is also true when it comes to asking for rain in Chutz La'aretz. We say the same Talamat Livracha. In the winter, we wait for, it follows according to the Kufa, right? It's following 60 days after the Kufa, and the math after the Kufa of Tishrei, and the math of 60 days after the Kufa of Tishrei follows the opinion of Shmuel. And the same thing is true. There's a halacha that you're not allowed to drink water during the time of the Kufa, during that period. The halacha also only follows the halacha of Shmuel, not the opinion of Rav Ada. So we see from these 3 examples that the opinion of Shmuel is brought down in halacha not just as a possibility, but it's mentioned as a halacha. So we see that the Kufa of Shmuel has halachic status also. What's the meaning behind it? How could the Kufa of Shmuel have halachic status if seemingly the Rambam tells us it's not accurate, it's not precise, and there are areas in halacha that according to Shmuel we don't understand how the halacha works out. So in order to understand why this is so, the Rebbe prefaces another halacha in Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh. The halacha is that if Beis Din announces that Rosh Chodesh is on a particular day, let's say there are witnesses who came on a particular day and said that on Tuesday they saw the new moon, and then afterward, and Beis Din pronounced that Tuesday is Rosh Chodesh based on the testimony of the new moon, of the witnesses, and then it turns out that the witnesses were saying something which wasn't true. Beis Din afterwards realized that there was a mistake. Whatever the case is, anything, even if they did it intentionally, let's say the Beis Din themselves have an agenda why they wanted to make Rosh Chodesh a day earlier, even Mezidin, according to one of the Girsais in the Gemara over there. The halacha is that Rosh Chodesh is according to the day that the Beis Din announced, and all the Yidden are obligated to set their Yamim Tovim based on the day that the Beis Din said. So the question is, how's that possible? If Beis Din made an announcement, and it turns out afterwards that they made a mistake, and the announcement is based on a fact that the moon is visible, if we find that afterwards that the moon is not visible on that day, and the witnesses never saw it, and the moon was never there, so how could we say that Rosh Chodesh is still there? How could we say that Rosh Chodesh is still there? So the Rambam tells us that the reason for this is because the same Eibush that told us to do the Yontif also told us that we have to rely on the Beis Din and listen to them. Okay, so this explains to us why once Beis Din said it, and the halacha is that Beis Din's pronouncement has validity, so the halacha is that we have to follow it. The question is, why does Beis Din's pronouncement have validity? If the Beis Din made the announcement and it's not accurate, why do we have to say it? So the answer, why do we have to follow it? So the answer is that when we speak about the sun and the moon and the kufos and the cycles and all these other things that we speak about over here, everything lamato, we know everything physically is but a reflection of a spiritual reality. There's something lamaila, spiritually, that's taking place, and everything that we have down here in the cycles and the systems and the setups, the galgalim, everything that we see down here is a reflection of something which is happening lamaila. What's the problem? The problem is that we don't have any idea on what's going on Lamaila. We don't understand Kufa Lamaila, what that means. We don't see it. We're not aware of it. It means nothing to us. So for us, if we want to have an insight, we want to have an idea on what's going on in the cheshbon, in the calculations Lamaila, what's our way of doing it? We look at the reality Lamata. And because the Lamata is supposed to be a reflection of the Lamaila, so we look at the Lamata, and that's where we operate. And that's true when it comes to seeing the moon. And we assume that when the moon is visible down here, it's a reflection of the Moilad and Lamaila. And when it's a reflection of the Moilad Lamaila, means that Lamaila is Rosh Chodesh. And therefore Lamata is Rosh Chodesh also. When we see the sun in a particular place, it tells us that Lamaila is also like that. And so on and so forth. So everything that we see in this context, everything that we see Lamata is a reflection of what's going on Lamaila. Says the Rebbe, what happens when Beis Din makes a pronouncement on a different day? Beis Din makes a pronouncement based on the expectation, let's say that the witnesses said a testimony, and it turns out that they didn't, that it wasn't true. So in that case, when the Torah tells us that we have to follow Beis Din, what the Torah is saying, not that we have to follow Beis Din, even if Beis Din doesn't know what they're talking about. What the Torah is saying is that when Beis Din said that today is Rosh Chodesh, even though really it was a mistake, what Torah is basically saying is that this month, L'mayla Rosh Chodesh is today. Now, down here we don't see it. In our reality, it didn't translate. In other words, somewhere in the link between the Lamaila and the Lamata, it didn't come to us. So we didn't see the new moon on that day. And even though the Eidim might have testified that they saw it, it wasn't true, it wasn't accurate, it doesn't make a difference. Because the main inyan of Kiddush HaChodesh, the main inyan of where these events are taking place is Lamaila. Usually the Lamata is a reflection of the Lamaila. But every once in a while it happens for one reason or another. For whatever reason, the world isn't roi, the world isn't fit to be a reflection of what's happening Lamaila. And in those cases, what ends up happening is that the world, Lamata, doesn't reflect the same reality the way it is Lamaila. So when Beis Din makes a pronouncement that Rosh Chodesh is supposed to be on a day, and then it turns out that Lamata is not a reflection of that, it doesn't mean that it's not Rosh Chodesh, it still is Rosh Chodesh. Why? Because Lamaila is Rosh Chodesh. What we see down here is missing, that link between Lamaila and Lamata is missing because we're not a keli for it. But the truth of what's happening Lamaila is still there. Once you understand this concept, you also understand that the same thing is true. The same thing is true when it comes to understanding the process of the Kufa Sachama, the Birka Sachama, and the halachos of when to calculate these things. When the Torah tells us a din that we're supposed to say a bracha on a particular day, the Torah is telling us that the bracha is connected to the Kufa of the moon, of the sun, the way it is Lamaila, the way it is in heaven. The fact that down here it doesn't translate, doesn't tell us, doesn't mean that we're doing the wrong thing. It doesn't mean that the idea of Beruchnis is still happening now. Because Beruchnis, the idea is still happening now, Torah is telling us that every 28 years at this time, Lamaila, something is happening with the Kufa, so that tells us that that's when we're supposed to be doing it. Now, Lamata, how does the Kufa show itself? What's the visibility of the Kufa Lamata? In our world, what's the accurate way, the way we see it? Kufa Sarvada, that comes out more accurate. But that's only in how it's reflected and how it's revealed Lamata. The way it is Lamaila, there's a truth to Shmuel also. Shmuel's Kufa Lamaila and this Inyan is more accurate. And that's why when it comes to us making the bracha, we follow the opinion of Shmuel. Kufa Shmuel, because Lamaila, that's the way that Kufa is Lamaila, that's the way the things are Lamaila, and that is the main mitzvah, the main bracha, the main takana of the bracha is following that calculation. Now, this alone isn't enough to explain it, and the reason why this alone isn't enough to explain it is because at the end of the day, Pshita Shel Mikra still says that you have to see the Kufa. So it seems like the whole Kufa is set up in such a way that we're following the halachos of the Kufa, at least when the dinim, at least with regards to the halachos of Birchas Achama, we're following the calculation of Shmuel, which is something that's never reflected in our world. In other words, it's never reflected over here in our reality. We're basically making a bracha on something that we're saying it's supposed to be this way. We're never experiencing it this way, but nevertheless, because Lamaila, that's the way it is, we're doing it. Now, and it's even more than that. The Rabbi adds that the Lashon, when it says Haroya Chama B'Tkufasa, means to see the sun in its Tkufa. In other words, it's something which is related to us seeing something. Now, we're not seeing anything of it because we're not seeing the right Kufa. According to the calculation of Rav Ada, which is the way we see it, there's no Kufa now. The Kufa is later, not according to the Kufa of Shmuel. So the question is, why is it that we do something? Why is it that we do it? Why is it that we're following the halacha only the way it is l'mayla, and it's not in a way that's not being reflected down here? Now, the truth is, when it comes to Kiddush HaChodesh, we say the same thing. We said that if the Beis Din announces that the day is Rosh Chodesh, and the day that the Beis Din announces is Rosh Chodesh is even if it's a mistake, it's still Rosh Chodesh, and we say the reason for that is because l'mayla, that's the way it is. So it's true. The difference is a very simple difference. The difference is that Rosh Chodesh is a halachic existence. Rosh Chodesh has no practical ramifications. Rosh Chodesh is a day that has halachas associated with it. It's a holy day, special karbanos, special davening that we have to do. In other words, it's easier to understand when it comes to Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tovim. When it comes to Rosh Chodesh, it's easier to accept that it's a halachic reality, it's a halachic existence, and therefore it makes more sense to say that l'mayla, we follow the way it is l'mayla. When it comes to the Kufa of Tishrei, when it comes to the Kufa of the sun, the Kufa of the sun and the calculation of the sun of when it's in the same place or the way it was in creation, there's no halachic ramification of that. It's a mitzvistic thing. It's a physical thing. So if it's a physical thing and a mitzvistic thing, it's not a halachic question. Which day do I bring a carbon? Which day do I add halal and davening? It's a question of when the sun is in the same place, a physical thing. So it's more difficult to understand why is it that when it comes to Kufa, do we follow the way it is l'mayla? It's seemingly the way it is l'mayla without having a reflection down here doesn't seem to go hand in hand with what the Kufa is all about. So the Rebbe goes on to explain, and the Rebbe says it's not true. The Rebbe explains that it's not that the Kufa specifically is something which is related specifically to the way it is l'mayla. In order to understand this, the Rebbe gives an introduction over here that there's a machlokes in the Gemara between Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yisroel, a very famous machlokes, when the world was created. Rabbi Lezer says the world was created in Tishrei. In other words, Adam Rishon, the world was created Chaf Hei Elul, and Adam Rishon was created Aleph Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, the way we celebrate. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Yeshua says B'nisin Nivra Olam, that Adam Rishon was the world was created Chaf Hei Adar, and Adam was created on Aleph Nisan. The halacha is, generally speaking, the halacha is B'nisin Nivra Olam. That's how we celebrate Rosh Hashanah. I'm sorry, but Tishrei. We celebrate Rosh Hashanah on Tishrei. Aleph Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah, not Aleph Nisan. Nevertheless, the halacha is that when it comes to Tkufos, we follow the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua. We say that for Tkufos, we don't start the calculation of Tkufos from the first Tishrei that the world was created. Instead, we go all the way back. We go all the way back to B'Nisan. We go back to Nisan. What does that mean? In other words, that for the Tkufos, we go back 2 extra seasons. We start calculating Tkufos from Nisan. In Halacha, there's an expression that we say, it's called a Shnas Tohu. It's a year of Tohu, which means it's a year that the world wasn't actually created. Why was the world not actually created? Because we follow Rabbi Lezer's opinion that the world was created in Tishrei. So the whole time, if we calculate backwards from Tishrei to Nisan, that whole 6 months going backwards never existed. It wasn't an existence that was real. Tohu, it didn't exist. In our world of Tikkun, in our world, it didn't exist. On some level in Tohu, it existed. Now, Chassidus explains that what's the difference between these two opinions of Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yeshua. The difference is Rabbi Lezer follows the opinion. Rabbi Lezer says that b'maise b'poyol brias olam was b'tishrei. Rabbi Yeshua says that b'machshava was Nisan. Rabbi Yeshua follows machshava. So in essence, Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Lezer are not arguing. Rather, Rabbi Yeshua is speaking about b'machshava and Rabbi Lezer is speaking about b'maise. So it comes out, according to this, if the halacha is that when it comes to Tkufos, we calculate the Tkufos going back to Nisan. In essence, what we're saying is that when it comes to Tkufos, we're not calculating the way it is b'maisa down here. The whole gather of Tkufos is being calculated as something which is b'machshava, which means some lomaylo, ilomatoyu. So in other words, the whole Tkufos is not being calculated based on what we see down here. Rather, it's being calculated based on the way it is lomaylo. So the same thing is true with all the halachos that are related to the Tkufos. We calculate them based on the way they are lomaylo, not the way they are lomata. Why? Because their main emphasis of the Tkufos are, even though we think that it's based on what we see over here, but really the Tkufos represent the machshava, the olah b'machshava, the fact that Hashem wanted to create the world b'machshava, going back to Nisan. So this explains why, when it comes to Tkufos, we follow the halacha, we follow the Kufa of Shmuel. Again, the Kufa of Shmuel highlights the way it is l'mayla, even though l'mata it doesn't always reflect. Why? Because when it comes to Tkufos, the main emphasis is The weight is Lamaila, B'machshava, Olam Atoyu, the Rabbi Yisroel's opinion of B'nisin Nivra Ha'olam. So this all is an explanation. This all is an explanation on the calculation of the years and the basics of the Tkufos. When we count the years, the Rambam tells us that in order to count the years, you have 19-year cycles, you have 7 years of Shana Muberes, and the Rambam tells us that for this we follow the opinion of Shmuel, because this is the main thing of the Tkufos, the extra hour and the Tav Pei Hey, 485 Chalakim. So when it comes to the Tkufos, that's the math that we use. Okay? When it comes to the years and the Tkufos, that's the math that we use. The problem is that, like we said earlier, this is not the ultimate. This is not the end game. Why? Because there's a din that, according to Kufa Shmuel, is not covered. And that din is Karban Pesach. In general, the Yontif of Pesach. The Yontif of Pesach also has to be during once Tkufas Nisan started already. According to Kufa Shmuel, there are years where year number 16 of the cycle is going to be after the Tkufa of Nisan. Is going to be before the Kufa of Nisan started, which means that Pesach is going to be during the winter season still, during the winter Kufa, and the halacha says that Pesach has to be during the Nisan, during the springtime Kufa. What's the answer? The answer is, okay, for that we follow the opinion of Rabbi. The question is why? The question is why, when it comes to Karban Pesach, over here, do we follow the way it is Lamata? If when it comes to Kufos we say we follow the way it is Lamaila, so why when it comes to Karban Pesach, or generally the Yontif of Pesach, why do we say the same thing? Why over there do we need to follow the opinion of Rav Ada? Why do we have to follow the way it is Lamata? Why do we have to have it only in such a way that's visible Lamata? Why can't we follow the opinion of Shmuel? So the answer is that when do we say that there could be an inyan that Lamaila is one way, Lamata is a different way? In other words, that the Lamata doesn't reflect the way it is Lamaila. When it comes to something which is only related to Velt, when it comes to something which is a Olam Dikim Mitzias, so we could say that Mitzad the Olam Dikim Mitzias, the Olam itself is not a Keli for the way it is Lamaila. So that's true when it comes to Tkufos, which by its very nature is an Olam Dikim thing. So we could say that there's a Tkufos the way it is B'machshava, there's Tkufos the way it is Lamata, and Tkufos the way it is Lamata, it wasn't Nimshach down here. The problem is when it comes to Karban Pesach is a mitzvah. Karban Pesach, or the Yontif of Pesach, I keep on saying Karban Pesach. The Yontif of Pesach, the fact that Pesach has to be during the springtime, this is a Torah Dikah thing. And because it's a Torah Dikah thing, it's something which the Torah itself says that this is the way to do the mitzvah. So because the whole Metzias of Pesach is a Torah Dikah thing, it has to be in such a way that the Kufa itself is revealed down here in order for the Torah Dikah Metzias down here to exist. So otherwise the Torah Dikah Metzias doesn't exist. So therefore, when it comes to Karban Pesach, the halacha is, when it comes to the Yontif of Pesach, the halacha is, that over here we follow the opinion of Rav Ada. According to the opinion of Shmuel, there's taka no way for it to work. Why? Because the opinion of Shmuel, we only use la halacha, only b'negeh olam dikah things. We don't use it when it comes to mitzvahs, Torah dikah things. Over there the Kufa has to be down here. And because the Kufa has to be down here, it has to follow only the opinion of Rav Ada and not the opinion of Shmuel. Now, according to this, we understand why when the Rambam tells us that he's relying on the opinion of Shmuel when it comes to making his calculations. In other words, in order for the month of Nisan to fall out during the springtime, not Pesach, when he speaks about the month of Nisan needs to be during the springtime. Over there he says that is according to the Kufa of Shmuel. Why? Because over there we're talking about the month. The month is not a Torah Dikah thing. The month, as which month we're speaking about, okay, that's a Velt thing. That's fine. When it comes to Shana, which is a Velt thing. Ashenkin, when it comes to the mitzvah of Karban Pesach, which is not a Velt of Pesach, which is a Torah Dikah Mitzias, over there we need that the Lamaila should be reflected Lamata, that the Mitzias, the Torah Dikah Mitzias that the Torah is talking about, should be something which matches up Lamaila the way it is Lamata also. Because the Lamaila and the Lamata have to match up. And therefore, when it comes to Pesach, over there we say that the only way to address it and to explain it is based on the opinion of Rav Ada, based on the Kufa of Rav Ada, which is exact without any extra times.